And at this point, I would like to start by presenting both of you, the speakers here. We got Neil Quilliam here, who is been around with us for quite a while. One of the top experts in the Middle East that I know of, and definitely will give us perspective about actors that I don't think get a lot of attention usually, which primarily would be Jordan. I would like to ask you a lot of questions about those. Colin, one of the top experts about counterterrorism and terrorism, and been covering the Middle East for quite a while. So Colin will be providing us also with a regional analysis of how we see this. The prime goal of today's webinar is really to review the implications of the potential scenarios on the regional perspective. Our report, which we published about a few weeks ago, was focused on Gaza, specifically on Gaza. We ignored completely almost the all regional aspects. We knew we're doing that on purpose because we wanted the scope to be very focused to have those scenarios for that. Today's webinar should be looked at as kind of a complementary level of analysis, looking at the potential implications of those kind of situation. So I want to start with you, Neil. And the first question I have is this. In an event that we do not see in any way or form the current situation basically reaching a peaceful, or at least the end of the war in Gaza, and Israel occupies Gaza, what does that mean on the regional level? And specifically, I would like to ask you if you can focus on three actors in your analysis: the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the potential for relations with the Saudis.
Okay, thank you. That's really challenging.
Yes.
Well, you're here, Neil.
A fastball straight from the start.
Absolutely. Hopefully this will be an iterative process, because I'm going to have to sort of think very much on my feet. So basically, continuation as we've got from now and for the next 2 years. In terms of the region, I mean, I just would see no major escalation beyond where we are at the moment. I would certainly see that, you know, the Egyptians just hunkering down where they are, the Jordanians just hunkering down. I don't see any major complication. I think we would just reach a point where it's almost, however you want to characterize it, that stalemate just sits there. There is no major push. There is no major move to go beyond that. I mean, we would need to think about, you know, the US and elections. Maybe that's something else. For the Saudis, I mean, there can be no forward movement on normalization as it is. So that, you know, so that prospect, we can just park that and forget that altogether. This would need to break that. This would need, you know, a major lift by the US with a little bit coming in from the EU. Then we may see the Egyptians and Jordanians moving into that space. But as is, I just see this just them hunkering down, to be honest, and just bedding in and holding on. But to do that for 2 years is a long time.
And Colin, how do you see maybe more specifically the Egyptians in a situation where Israel take over again the Gaza Strip in some sort of constellation? But how do you see the Egyptians basically being impacted and responding to such a scenario?
Well, I largely agree with Neil that they'd adopt a kind of hunker down approach, but I think it also leads to a number of fairly significant challenges for Egypt. One, what happens to the status of militancy in the Sinai Peninsula, right? Even if the government in Cairo looks to kind of hibernate and you know, minimize the impact on Egypt writ large, which I don't think is a guarantee. I think there's going to be some real qualms in the domestic populations of Egypt and Jordan if what we have is an Israeli occupation for the next 2 years. If we have a steady stream of Palestinian civilian casualties, if the Israelis are occupying Gaza 2 years from now, it also means Hamas is largely intact and that the mission has not been complete. And so what kind of political pressures does that put on regions in the government? I think, as you guys know, the Islamic State in the Sinai, the Egyptians have made some pretty significant progress in combating that group, but it's not static. And I would say that for IS affiliates across the globe, does this become a cause célèbre in some ways, even given the kind of bad blood between IS and Hamas? The Islamic State is continuously denigrated Hamas as apostates for sitting for elections. Nevertheless, if you've paid attention to their propaganda like I have, they're still seeking to leverage what's happening in Gaza to recruit, right, as a kind of because an anti-Israeli narrative has long formed the core of a lot of the things the Islamic State talks about. So I think it poses a number of challenges, both politically but also logistically. For Egypt, I would say the same thing for Jordan. There's probably 2 years in growing pressure to take in Palestinians, which both countries have been pretty upfront that they don't have the capacity and, frankly, the political will to do. And then, I also agree with Neil that normalization with Saudi is kind of paused because it would make it really, really difficult, frankly, unpalatable for MBS to move forward without some kind of, I don't even think, if there were a quote unquote pathway toward a Palestinian state, it would be enough. There's got to be some kind of guarantees for Palestinian statehood to now make this palatable for Riyadh, which I think largely wants normalization to happen. In fact, we wrote about this yesterday for the Soufan Center Intel brief. We called it a mirage because they're largely cooperating, Israel and Saudi, behind closed doors. I think MBS very much wants to formalize this, but post 10/7, the equation for him has become a lot more difficult in his country.
Colin, I do want to ask you a specific question about Hamas. In case of the scenario that Israel maintains its military in the Gaza Strip, do you think Hamas will adopt a modus operandi which is more similar to organizations such as Hezbollah or ISIS and start forming attacks abroad, which is something they have avoided so far?
Yeah, good question. In fact, I was in Washington earlier this week discussing that exact question with various elements in the Beltway. I do. So, and I've gotten some pushback on this. I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago posing the question, could Hamas go global? And I had some very senior folks in the U.S. government push back at this notion and say, well, it's not really in Hamas's interest. They don't really have the infrastructure. But I think we need to look beyond Hamas and we need to look at Iran, right? Because if Hamas is able to go global, it will largely be because of Iran. The same way, and I know they're not the same group and there's a lot of differences between Hamas and Hezbollah, but in the same way that, Iran dedicated decades to funding, training, equipping, and setting up Hezbollah as a global terrorist organization, I think there's an incentive to do that with Hamas. Clearly, there's ideological differences, and it's not the same group, but it certainly behooves the Iranians to do so because it spreads the United States and the Israelis thin. If we have to worry about chasing these guys all over Latin America, it stretches bandwidth. So it is a card I think the Iranians could play, and I think a lot depends on what happens politically in Gaza. If there's a dead end there, we're likely to see Hamas extend beyond the borders of the immediate region, I think.
Neil, what is your opinion about this?
I mean, my instinctive response is probably the one that would be the pushback that Colin received, to his piece. I find it hard to imagine that Hamas would have the will or the capacity to sort of become international. But I guess thinking about it, I mean, as Colin said, maybe that's a space where the Iranians would want to invest and build that out. But that would certainly be, a major and new development. I'm sort of struggling to see it actually happening, but as I'm playing out sort of logically in my mind, if there's nowhere else to go, I mean, if they're just so squashed or crushed in Gaza, maybe there is that desire or will for that to happen. Well, how Qatar fits into that is another story. So So we'd really need to sort of tease that out and think about that.
And I'd just like to add, if I could just say very briefly, one of the exercises as a counterterrorism analyst that I've forced myself to go through post 10/7 is re-examining the quote unquote conventional wisdom. All those things that almost everyone agrees would never happen, like Hamas launching the type of attack they did on 10/7. I'm starting with a blank slate here, right? And so all of our prior assumptions that we were so wedded to, many of them have fallen by the wayside. I think, and that's one of the things that led me to think of this piece. And I will be honest, I got beat up pretty hard, in some ugly ways, as it happens online, right, in the Twitter sphere or whatever, X or whatever you want to call it. But a lot of the reasons why I write pieces like this, it's food for thought. It's to generate some pushback and to get us to go beyond our kind of current mental constructs and to think about things in a different way. And so it's a bit risky, but I think necessary at the same time if we're going to kind of get outside of these traditional analytic frames we have.
So let me ask you, Neil, about this from maybe a little bit more specific angle, and that is, do you see a potential possibility in which Hamas form kind of a Fatah-land back to the 70s in the Egyptian side of the Sinai Peninsula with the border with Gaza as a way to launch attacks, to even risking their relations with the Egyptians? Do you see this is something that could potentially evolve as something that's the violence in Gaza, in case of an Israeli military occupation, will actually spill over into Egypt in the form of Hamas starting operations from there to attack within Israel or within Gaza?
I like these questions. I guess that's a possibility, but from an operational point of view, from a capacity point of view, I'm not sure that they're going to have that operational space. I don't think the Egyptians are going to, permit that. So I would have thought this might be, if we were going to go down that route and we're thinking around that, it might be incubated further afield rather than right there on the, in the Sinai. Although, as Colin says, that's fertile ground. I would have thought they may have, decamped somewhere else, developed some capacity, some capability, maybe just developing that thought, carried out a few attacks elsewhere, and then look for a home. That's how I would imagine it playing out. I think it's more that kind of operational space that would be difficult to decamp to.
Let me jump to a second scenario here and some follow-up questions on that. So in case that we're back into the October 6th situation, and one of the scenarios we have discussed in the report was essentially the victorious Hamas, essentially that Hamas has managed to maintain their control of the Gaza Strip, release of their prisoners, and the withdrawal of Israeli troops outside of Gaza. How would that impact the regional security, Colin? I mean, will be obviously something that could be encouraging for some groups. And I'm talking about groups that are not necessarily the ones that we immediately identify, such as Hezbollah or ISIS, but for example, Muslim Brotherhood groups, both in Jordan and in Egypt or somewhere else. So how could that impact regional security, a scenario where Hamas is actually victorious, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my initial questions would be to say, how do we define success, right? And I know, I mean, I've spent a lot of my career, especially my early career at RAND, working on insurgency and counterinsurgency. And one of the old maxims is insurgents win simply by not losing, right? But like, is Sinwar still at the head? What percentage of Hamas is still intact? What are the group's objectives? Are they, now relegated to playing a more kind of governance type role inside of Gaza, or are they still very actively trying to launch rockets at Israel?
So I will make it more specific. The scenario, let me visualize it to you. The scenario
Sure.
literally goes into victory parade on October 7, 2026. With Sinwar heading that parade with the prisoners. Literally, this was the visualization that we have put in the report as a scenario. So this is literally what we're doing: a parade. Gaza is destroyed, obviously, and every thing related to the war is still there. But from a victory point of view, this is what I want you to envision.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. Tactically, I'd say it would be unwise from an OPSEC perspective to be heading some kind of a parade, because that's a big fat target. But I get what you're saying, right? So what does it do for groups in the region, including Muslim Brotherhood type groups? Look, I think it emboldens them, right? Because it shows that it's possible to achieve victory if you are able to withstand kind of the current pressure. There's just, it's so complicated, as you know, because there are I don't think it behooves Israel to occupy the Gaza Strip indefinitely. And I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs last week that kind of warned against mission creep. But at the same time, withdrawing prematurely before certain military objectives have been accomplished, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I think Hamas knew this from day one, right? The goal was to kind of not only kill a lot of Israelis, but to kind of lure the Israelis into Gaza and attempt to attrit them, bleed them indefinitely, right? Maybe they envision like a Lebanon 1982 type thing, and a long-term opportunity to kill Israeli soldiers. But I think it's certainly, maybe I'll defer to Neil on the Muslim Brotherhood question, but I would say the axis of resistance writ large, Lebanese Hezbollah, Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, certainly receive a shot in the arm from this, because it shows them what's in the realm of the possible, and it probably encourages them to continue to work in concert toward what Iran's called its unity of front strategy, right? The brainchild or the realization of what Qasem Soleimani had been working on. And I think it emboldens the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force too, and the mullahs in Iran, in Tehran. And I think overall, it's if that's what we're looking at, October 7th, 2026, things have gone terribly wrong between now and then.
Neil, let me rephrase the question a little bit for you, just because of the expertise. How could Hamas victory with this scenario envisioned in October 7, 2026, as I envisioned it before, could impact regional security, specifically the stability of countries such as Jordan or Egypt, from the Muslim Brotherhood relations with the regimes there?
So it would be a shot in the arm for the Brotherhood in Jordan, most definitely. But I don't see it as fomenting anything, fomenting unrest or fomenting any significant sort of change within Jordan. But it would maybe sort of redress some balance between the regime and the Brotherhood, and the role that the Brotherhood plays in society. There's I don't know how you want to characterize it at the moment, but there's a sort of a political capital deficit, we could say, that the regime is carrying as a consequence of what we're seeing playing out in the region. And we've seen the Brotherhood get a bit of a boost from this. So I think it would kind of maybe validate that they do present not an alternative to the regime, but they certainly present an alternative to the parliamentary composition at the moment. So I see them as probably benefiting from it, feeling some form of validation. I don't think the scenario is going to happen, by the way, but I see some validation. But it's not going to inspire. It's not going to lead to something major. I'd characterize it as a shot in the arm.
Now I want to jump into the third scenario, which is the one that for a lot of policymakers, it's the one that they would like to see as the end result of this, which is the PNA back into Gaza within some sort of constellation. If it's part of a peace agreement, a continuation of the Oslo agreement into a Palestinian state, if it's a technocrat regime, more like the Israeli government would like it to be, but in some form or way, or maybe Dahlan coming back in as a kind of a wild card from the wild. So in some form or way, we're talking about the PNA return to the Gaza Strip. In the report, we discussed a lot about the practicality of this. I mean, this is something that will require, at the very least, the establishment of a security force of between 20 to 30,000 trained forces. This is a massive a massive operation in terms of both recruiting, training, etc., will take years. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. Hence, the timeline of 2026, even more than that, to some of the experts we spoke. But we were trying to put it all in one line, so to speak. So, if the PNA returns, and that return is happening in some way or form in which we will see Hamas being part of the PNA or part of that government. Do you see this as something that could have implications on the regional security from not necessarily vis-a-vis Palestinians, Israelis, but more on the regional actors? Is that something that could be more destabilizing to the security in the region?
Do you want me to start on that one?
Oh, I'm sorry. First one to Colin, and let me be more specific. What I'm asking is if we see a PNA return to Gaza in which the PNA actually have Hamas integrated as part of the PNA. This is basically the question I'm asking here.
Sure. So I dumped a link into the chat, which is from a War on the Rocks piece that I wrote just recently, where I looked at. This is based on some of the research I did when I was at RAND, where we looked at 71 insurgencies, all insurgencies from the end of World War II to 2009, and picked up on some common themes that we found and trends in these insurgencies. Another piece that I got a lot of heat for because I made that exact suggestion, which is for a sustainable negotiated settlement, it's very likely that Hamas is going to have to form some part of this government. It's totally unpalatable to even think about for most Israelis right now. And even in the piece, I make the statement, this isn't a policy recommendation for Israel to go and do this. However, if this is a path the Israelis go down, for it to actually be meaningful and to last, there's going to have to be some kind of Hamas political representation, as hard as that is to swallow at the moment. Otherwise, you're basically condemning them to be a terrorist group ad infinitum, right? You're saying you're not part of the government, you never will be, and we're now going to fight you, right? It almost reminds me in some ways of debathification, which was one of the biggest missteps in U.S. foreign policy, arguably in the last several decades, right? We took all the guys that were trained with weapons, we told them, you're out of a job, beat it. And it was like instant insurgency, right? Just add water. So there's going to be some of that. I think you're likely still going to end up fighting some kind of splinter of Hamas because there will be hardliners that will never accept any kind of negotiated settlement with Israel. But you want to get to a place where that's the smallest possible sliver, right? And co-opt in some way large chunks of Palestinians. And I also think if you look at polling data, Hamas is now more popular in the West Bank than they've been in a long time, right? So to condemn them to the sidelines is really a half measure, in my opinion. I think, it's probably not likely now in 2 years, given the kind of domestic political sentiments, which are totally understandable, or frankly, the posture of the current Israeli government, including some of the far right elements in there, that this is a non-starter for. In 2 years from now, following on, another kind of 24 months of a stalemate, does this become, more of a possibility? Probably. It just depends on what's the right role that, what's the percentage, what's the balance that Hamas would be, vice this technocratic kind of, Palestinian authority that's waiting in the wings, which I'm also a bit skeptical about, to be totally honest. I think it also opens Gaza up to the regional players, right? Because who's sponsoring Dalan, right? Isn't he an advisor for the UAE? So it now becomes a cog in this great game that's been playing out in the Gulf and other parts where you have opposing actors basically sponsoring their side. So it's just moving the proxy war to proxy politics. Let me stop there because I'm curious to see what Neil has to say on this.
So Neil, the floor is yours on this one.
Thank you. Colin, I agree with everything you said. Disappointing.
I don't think anyone's ever said that.
I wish I could pick that apart somewhat. I don't want to repeat it, but I mean, an element of Hamas, whatever that means or whatever that looks like, has to be part of some governing arrangement. If you have total exclusion, then as you said, I mean, that's just gonna end in disaster. So I don't think there can be that exclusion. The question was also about sort of regional, the regional security? How would it affect regional security? And I think it does play into that piece as, who's backing whom from, from the regional states. But I think if Hamas is, and again, to Colin's point, I find it so difficult to imagine, and we have to go back and redraw our assumptions, but to see the PNA coming into that space and understanding how it's going to assert its authority and how it's going to operationalize and administer, that's a whole other thing.
Who pays for it too?
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. That's absolutely right. But if Hamas are part of that, and that's tied into that governing structure, a part of Hamas, then in a way that can sort of perhaps embed. I mean, the Emiratis are not going to be too happy with that. The Saudis are definitely not going to be too happy with that. Qatar will be much happier with that. They can sort of play in that space. So to me, the question is, to what extent can those three and the Jordanians, kind of play nice on this and try to make that work? Can they come together and gel around that, or are they going to play in that space? Is that going to become the other kind of proxy element that Colin was talking about? I don't have an answer to that. Aspirationally, they should work together, but I'm not sure that's how it's going to play out. And definitely the Emiratis are not going to be happy if Hamas are part of some governing structure.
Neil, let me ask you this as a follow-up question. In case Hamas is part of a government that is controlling both the West Bank and Gaza, kind of a situation where we have, like, let's say in Ireland, the separation between the political and the armed movement, and transforming the whole thing into a political movement. What would be the implications when it comes to Iran? Because in many forums, one of the analysts we spoke to said, in the long term, that means that Iran basically lost one of their biggest assets in the region. In such a situation, such a constellation mean that Hamas is no longer available for Iran, because that would be definitely one of the main conditions for such a thing to happen. So how would that, in your opinion, would play out?
If I could just roll you back to the West Bank, so my working kind of supposition here was that this would play out in Gaza. I can't imagine that the PNA or the PA are going to want to be working with Hamas in the West Bank. There's no way they're going to want to share that space. I mean, I'll just posit that there. I find that really difficult. So many things today are difficult to sort of envisage and work through, but that in itself is just too much and too big. In terms, yes, Iran would lose that access, would lose that lever. I mean, I think in your report, and I would tend to agree with that. I mean, the two, Hamas and Iran, aren't completely aligned. I think Hamas has its own kind of strategy, its own operational framework, and yes, it draws on Iranian support. I'm not sure that the Iranians would even be willing to kind of turn off that tap. They would try to find their ways through to reach Hamas. It might not be Hamas central, if we want to call it that element, that component that's working with the PA, but there will certainly be other factions of Hamas and other splinter groups that it can reach and it can find its way in. I think that's how these groups operate. They fragment and splinter, and dimensions of them can always be peeled away.
Colin, the question to you, let me rephrase it just to sharpen it up a little bit. In case Hamas is part of the political solution in the Gaza Strip, how will that impact Hamas relations with Iran?
Yeah, so let me posit a middle way, if you will, which is, again, look at Hezbollah. I think by the terms of, what was it, the Taif Agreement in 1989 that ostensibly ended the Lebanese civil war, Hezbollah shouldn't have an army, but they do, and they also sit in Lebanon's parliament. So this is what I call, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I'm having very terrible flashbacks at the moment to my PhD dissertation. So excuse me if I'm pausing. I just spent years of my life working on this topic. But essentially the research question I interrogated was, why do some terrorist groups become political parties while others don't? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I looked very closely at the IRA, the Provisional IRA, and Sinn Féin. I looked very closely at Hezbollah, as a kind of middle ground. I looked at some groups that never made the transition and others that did, like the African National Congress. I think Iran would try to thread that needle. They would try to support Hamas politically while also maintaining some kind of armed wing, call it a Qassam Brigades light. And actually, here's a chance where, or here's an area where it might behoove them to do that external to Gaza. Think about where the training took place for this attack in Lebanon, right? There was meetings in Iran and elsewhere. You may have a potential byproduct of some kind of political negotiation be Hamas attempting to keep their guns surreptitiously, and that might have to be done outside of the Palestinian territory. So there's all these second order effects that I think we need to be very careful in thinking through. Otherwise, we're going to go down a road where there's good intentions that end up having kind of ramifications that we quite haven't planned for. It could be a better situation than today, right? Because we won't be in active combat, but it won't have actually fully satisfied the problems that we're dealing with. It just kind of makes new problems elsewhere. And I think while the IRA is an interesting case in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of factors and variables that make it quite different than in the current situation.
Sorry, one of the questions we have received before this webinar was about the traditional actors maybe not playing their role, and maybe it's time for new actors in the region. And the name that came up is this is time maybe for China to be part in some sort of a regional agreement that all sides can agree on, or to be involved in some form of way. I'm asking this question because from the perspective of the analysts that we've spoken to, China has never been mentioned. Yet in the Gulf, we do see China is slowly has increased in their presence and their involvement. Do we see any possibility, and I'll start with you, Neil, that China might be in any way or form, even remotely kind of a way involved in this situation, maybe in 2 years from now, as part of some mechanism to establish the P&A control in Gaza? So I'm talking about the third scenario in which maybe the Chinese could be involved. I know this question looks very far-fetched. I completely, this is not what I would say a typical question, but I want to push on the envelope here and ask you, do you see a potential involvement of China in a scenario where the P&A take over the Gaza Strip?
So I put it this way, I've seen no evidence to convince me of that. There's nothing really. 2 years ago, actually no, sorry, before COVID, I was in and out of Beijing and Shanghai a few times, meeting with, having different meetings with think tanks there, and meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we held discussions around Syria, we held discussions around the peace process, and certainly there were kind of expressions of interest in wanting to find a role or find a way into that. But I don't think the appetite is there, or the appetite has yet materialized. Even with a 2-year time frame, I find that difficult to imagine them engaging in any meaningful way or trying to translate what might just be their interest. So I don't think it's a far-fetched question. I think it's one that we do need to consider and to interrogate. And if you gave me a longer time frame, maybe 5 or 8 years, I might look at that and think, well, perhaps that's something that's going to happen. But I think within a 2-year time frame, I've seen nothing coming out of Beijing that suggests that's going to happen.
Colin, to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the Gulf, certainly we've seen the Chinese, at least the Chinese rhetoric kind of hyping up a little bit around what the Houthis are doing and how it's not really helpful and is driving up commercial shipping costs. But in Gaza, I mean, I largely agree with Neil. I just don't see it happening in that time frame. I dumped a link into the chat for a piece. This is a bit dated. It's from 2020 that I wrote with Ali Wan, formerly of the Eurasia Group, kind of looking at what China and Russia are doing in the Middle East. I just also think we can't look at our adversaries, and here I'm speaking as an American, in this kind of veneer of great power competition, and think that everything they do is this masterstroke of genius. We fell into that trap with the Russians. Everything Putin did was this masterstroke. we're playing checkers, he's playing 7-dimensional chess. Look, our adversaries make missteps just like we do. And, part of my argument, and some of it was tongue in cheek of like, oh, cool, you're going to fill the power vacuum in the Middle East. Please be my guest. Have fun while you're there doing it too, right? It's not easy to think that you can navigate all these relationships. And look, at the end of the day, China has been somewhat of a free rider in the system. I think it'll continue to do so with the Middle East and parts of Africa, where Beijing tries to extract maximum benefit with having the least amount of skin in the game as possible, and continue to work things from an economic perspective, but unlikely from a military perspective. And look, the U.S. is just a fact of life in the region, whether other countries like it or not. U.S. military infrastructure and basing is going to be, this is a long-term change. If we see it at all, that's going to happen. The U.S. isn't going to willfully leave the Middle East despite a lot of hand-wringing. And I don't see China kind of encroaching on that anytime soon.
I'm going to follow up on this question with another question we have received prior to this webinar. Neil, do you see any regional or an international actor that can fill in the security needs on the one hand and would be accepted by the Palestinian as a potential kind of, I would say, entity to be ruling the Gaza Strip, or at least giving a security envelope while the PNA or some mechanism of government is ruling the Gaza Strip? Do you see anything like that? For example, a Turkish force or a Saudi, Pakistani force? I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to a few experts. I heard everything from I would say the entire universe was basically was thrown into it. Any kind of an apparatus, a security apparatus that involve a security or regional force in Gaza Strip providing some sort of a security envelope?
I'm sorry, you gave me a very long question, and my answer is no. I thought about this before, obviously coming on the webinar, and tried to sort of imagine all kind of scenarios and thinking, well, a regional actor who's going to move into that space. I can't imagine any other actor wanting to move into that space, because as soon as you move into that, you've got to own it. And when you own it, that's going to be difficult. It's not just a day trip going in and out. Owning it is a costly and weighty venture, and I see no regional country or international country that would have that appetite or the political will or the risk appetite actually for doing so. So when I read about these kind of scenarios that you might have, I don't know, an Arab League force, an Arab deterrent force, or what it might be, I dismiss it almost instantly. Then I go back, and then, as Colin said, we do have to look at our assumptions and rework them. But I just find that too much to consider, given what the cost would be. So back to my original answer, no.
Colin, is this going to be a short answer too?
I'll give a cliche. To most, if not all countries, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. I think, the Abraham Accords showed that even regionally, the Palestinians are an afterthought, right? Now everybody's got to get out in front of this and say, oh, post 10/7, I'm this great champion of, a Palestinian statehood. But the Abraham Accords show otherwise. I think this is a nuisance and an inconvenience for Saudi and some other countries that were hoping to proceed apace until this happened. And, I think the Iranians know that. I mean, they're thrilled at playing the role of spoiler. I think there's a lot of other things that we could look at too, including some of these proposed new trade routes and what role those played, right? With all of a sudden Iran being bypassed, trade routes running through Haifa and other parts. I do wonder, not to get too Illuminati here, what role those played. And I'm not, a purveyor of conspiracy theories or disinformation, but at the end of the day, there's some geopolitical moves that I think are high stakes. That is where I think China has a wary eye on this through, BRI and kind of projections down the road. But I think what Neil described in not so many words was what we've called in the U.S. Colin Powell's Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you own it, right? And nobody really wants to own that, frankly. The only potential scenario I could see down the road is, maybe a country like UAE that is very aggressive, intervening in kind of regional conflicts. providing some kind of a force for, but toward what end, right? And we're seeing some of this right now in Afghanistan, where you've got, who's running the airport over there. And so you have the Turks, you have the Emiratis, you have some others kind of jostling for leverage. I think some of that's happening in Sudan, some of that's happening in the Horn of Africa as well, and all these kind of interesting conflicts or interesting things that are percolating just below the surface, right? Some of the geopolitical dynamics with the Egyptians, the Ethiopians over the GERD. And so there's these other things that I think matter, but at the end of the day, don't matter enough for somebody to co-sign this.
So I want to, this was a question that fit into, I would say, the fourth scenario, which is an international actor is providing the security envelope. It's a scenario we kind of drop off while we were writing the report. And we focus on those three main scenarios: an Israeli control, Hamas October 6th situation, and a PNA return as the ones that were more realistic in some way or form. Still situation involved on the ground. And I want to ask you, Neil, from the perspective of going back into the potential of having a scenario in which Israel back into control of the Gaza Strip, 2026, 2027, Israel is still there. How would that impact the peace accords with Egypt and with Jordan? Do you see a threat to the stability of the peace accords between Israel and those two states?
I don't see a threat to the peace accords. I mean certainly, public opinion is where it is, but it's never been favorable for the peace treaties. In Jordan, I mean, you have obviously have a growing number of MPs. You've always had parliamentarians who have, called for the abrogation of this. You do have cabinet ministers who question, the value, but I don't see it. I see the peace treaty, the peace accords as being sustained. I mean, they've lasted for over 30 plus years, whatever it is now. Unless there is a groundswell opposition that poses a significant challenge, and I'm talking in Jordan here, not Egypt at the moment, a significant challenge to the regime, where it feels that it has to make that move. But that would have to be something huge and big. And at the end of the day, I mean, I look at Jordan's, it's the peace treaty is all about the US. And that's where the key relationship is. So it can't afford to abrogate or tinker. It can come out with the rhetoric, but that's not the case. Likewise, unless there's some major change in Egypt, and the Egyptian economy is in poor shape at the moment, and who knows where that country, well, we may have some idea where the country is tending. I don't see the peace treaty unless there's a major shift or change in government. But even if that comes through, even if there's a change in the military to military relations with Israel is just too strong, too sustainable. So again, sorry, I'm giving you basically the same answer, but in a long-winded way. No, we will see rhetoric, we will see stresses and strains in the relationship, but I see the treaties as being sustained.
Colin, how do you see the situation in which Israel is basically controlling the Gaza Strip in 2026, 2027, impacting the peace accords and their stability with Egypt and with Jordan?
I think it all depends on what happens to Gazans. Are they still there living under occupation, or is there some concerted effort to force them across borders? And that's even still, I don't know if that's anything more than a threat that the Egyptians kind of will keep trotting out with little intention on following through with it. This that could potentially damage the peace treaty, because we've already heard rumors of that, and it's largely in response to far right Israeli ministers that are, they'll go on and make some comment. That comment will, which is I think intended to do, gain a lot of traction in the media. Someone will then pose that question. Well, Ben-Gvir said this. And then the Egyptians are left with, well, if that happened, we would respond by, re-looking at the treaty. But again, I think a lot of this is posturing. I think a lot of it's rhetoric. For that to actually happen would be a fairly major tectonic shift in the region. And I also think that, given this, at least this current administration's attention to diplomacy and sending Blinken over, that the U.S. would have a lot to say about that as well. If we're in a 2026 scenario and we have a Trump presidency, it's anybody's guess. Depends on the day, which way the wind's blowing. We really don't know. In that sense, would it just be, does U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East follow whatever, the Saudis want to do? Maybe. But again, it's just, it's so fickle one day to the next to try to predict what the strategy would be there.
So, as a final question, before I give you both the stage for final remarks, I talked about the existing peace accords with Jordan and Egypt. I want to talk about the Abraham Accords. Do you see a situation in this scenario in which Israel is still controlling the Gaza Strip, in which the Abraham Accords are basically are being threatened or are being put at risk? I know that looking at it today, the answer is probably no, because if they're still there, but 2 or 3 years down the road, do we see them still as stable as they are today? That is basically the question. And the other question is, in case 2 or 3 down the road, we enter in this kind of a situation where Israel controls the Gaza Strip, but there's no fighting, does it open the door to normalization with Saudi Arabia, between Israel and Saudi Arabia? So I'll start with you, Neil, then to you, Colin. We have about 3 minutes for this, 3-4 minutes, and then I'll give you also the stage for your final remarks. So, Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, I wrote a report with my colleague Salam Vakil on the Abraham Accords, and this obviously was way before October the 7th. I mean, I think they're durable. They're multifaceted. The ties are strong. I mean, we may see, fewer ventures, less economic activity, but I think the fundamentals of the relationship are still there. I think they're strong. I think it would just take something massive to even have them suspended. So I see them as just continuing as is. Less publicity around that. More kind of under the table deals, but probably continuing. But there's that kind of the tie for the Abraham Accords, as far as I'm concerned, they are multifaceted. Is the tie-in with the U.S., Israel, UAE, and the U.S. That's a key piece for holding those together, working with the U.S. And then also kind of meeting the challenge or the threat from Iran. Those things are still very much present. And so I think that as long as those components are there, and they're going to remain there, the Abraham Accords are going to stay there. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? I'll answer that in 10 seconds.
The second part is, in general, if we see a situation where there's no more fighting in the Gaza Strip, there's an Israeli control of the Gaza Strip with some sort of security arrangement, does it close the door, or does it close the door, or does it actually open the door to an Israeli-Saudi normalization?
I think so the way I look at it, the door is ajar at the moment. I think that the door will stay ajar. I think, as Colin said, there's a lot of activity taking place anyway. There are relations there. It's just that they're not called normalization, and they're not announced, or there's nothing public around that space. But so I'd just say the door will stay ajar.
Colin, your remarks on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to give the audience some kind of fireworks here and vehemently disagree with Neil, but I largely see it through the same lens as he does. Again, door likely stays ajar. It's an enshrinement of what's happening already. In some cases, the Abraham Accords have been an incentive to get countries to kind of, I mean, if you look at the Sudanese aspect of it, right? Hey, if you do this, we'll do that. It's been a bit more transactional. And again, I think it's something that most sides involved want to happen, as long as the specter of Iran as a threat in the region is still present, which it will be. It's a forcing function in many ways for these types of arrangements to happen. I think again, U.S. domestic politics is a bit of a wild card here, depending on what happens in November. But in either case, both administrations are largely, I think, in tune with the kind of current, the current status quo. If there's an Israeli occupation of Gaza with no fighting, I think, the occupation part makes life a bit more difficult for the Saudis, but not impossible, especially if, we're several years out, and we don't see the kind of intense fighting that we do again today. Because again, think about pre-10/7, you know, the Palestinians weren't really on the top of Saudi's wish list, right? It was really a rubber stamp, if anything. So if we're 2 years out from today, how much does that fervor, abate within kind of the quote unquote Arab street, which I don't love that term, but the euphemism, you kind of get what I'm talking about. I think that's a big question, and we could be in a different space there.
So we have about 4 minutes before we conclude. Closing remarks from you, Neil, and then Colin, your closing remarks.
Thank you. My closing remarks are, I think there was a question earlier about two-state solution. I won't go into that, but I think there are sort of many building blocks as to how that could be put together and how that could work. But I also think there are many more obstacles to that happening. So I don't see that happening. I do see the Palestinian issue as Colin has said, as it's almost an afterthought. It's something like, no, we didn't think about that when we were putting the Abraham Accords together. Now it's come up. Now it's a pain. It's actually an issue that we have to kind of deal with, but we don't really want to invest in that, and we don't want to own it. So I very much kind of see almost like we can't describe what we're seeing in Gaza at the moment as the status quo, but I think it's going to settle into a status quo where Israel is either going to remain a force. I don't know whether we call that occupying, but it's certainly going to have a semi-permanent presence. It's not going to let up its footprint. I don't see the PNA going in and working with Hamas. I just sort of see just being a mess, basically. And neither the US, neither Israel, neither the Gulf Arab states, neither the EU, neither China nor China, none of those are really going to be willing to sort of put the pieces back together. They may say nice things about a Palestinian state, but the will, the capacity, the money is simply not there. So I just see this as just going to be a long running saw. That would be my kind of scenario.
Yeah.
Colin?
If I had a bumper sticker to describe it, it would be kicking the can down the road, which is largely what got us here. I also might point out, but I don't see the imperative for those dynamics to change anytime soon. I think this has continued to be, and that's the other thing. I mean, I'm invited on a lot of kind of cable news networks in the States here, and people want a really nice, compact answer about, what does the future of a Palestinian state look like? 30 seconds, please. And you're like, oh, okay, where should I start? But I will say, I think, the timelines we're talking about. Well, let me take one step back and very briefly. I commend you for doing these exercises and thinking through these scenarios because it's really necessary. I'm someone who spent a lot of his career wargaming, mostly as a red teamer, so I like to poke holes in things. I think, and that's a lot harder than giving an actual solution. So I think these exercises are really necessary, and I hope people are watching these, webinars and reading these reports and preparing, right? Because I think that's one of my main criticisms of Israeli strategy now is that there hasn't been much thought given to the day after. Right? There's been a focus on a military strategy divorced from some of the geopolitical dynamics we're talking about now. But I do think the timelines you're also talking about are accurate because, despite whatever, Secretary of State Blinken wants to say, these are issues that if they are solved at all, will be solved in the course of years, not months. And so we also need to kind of prepare for that politically.
Colin, Neil, I want to thank you both for this fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, not an optimistic end, which we will all hoping for, but definitely an interesting discussion with a lot of fascinating insights. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar. I want to thank all of our all of our audience guests that were logging in online and sent us questions in advance also that we managed to ask during this webinar as well. I do wish to remind everyone that there will be a recording of this webinar posted online to our social media channels, YouTube and on LinkedIn, right, Ali? I think so. 2, there is the report. The report is online. If you haven't got it, you can contact us. We will send it to you. And 3, there will be more webinars coming down the road. One of them, I think one of the topics that we kind of touched the surface on, but we didn't go into, and that's a completely different webinar, is the impact of US elections and their impact on the Middle East, different scenarios for US elections and how that could play down the road with the US. With the Middle East security and the Middle East and in the Middle East in itself. So I want to thank you all for being here, and that's it basically. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.